Imagine that the most obvious and familiar things you knew about World War II are nothing more than cinematic lies, a convenient version for someone, or political manipulation. Good afternoon. You are on the channel 33 Facts. Here we tell amazing stories, debunk historical myths, and show the true face of events that were kept silent for decades. Make yourself comfortable. We begin. Lie 1. One rifle for two soldiers was the norm in the Red Army. Movies show dramatic scenes where crowds of Soviet soldiers run into attack, and half of them are unarmed, waiting for the comrade with a rifle to die. Yes, there were episodes at the front when weapons were lacking. This happened in the first months of the war, during encirclements and the chaos of retreats. But showing this as a system throughout the whole war is a complete fabrication. By 1943, the Soviet Union had a colossal advantage in artillery and tanks. Industry was working at full capacity. Factories produced millions of barrels. Where did this myth come from? From Goebbels' Nazi propaganda, which convinced Germans that they were fighting a horde of savages driven into battle with sticks and shot from behind. Cinema picked up this fake and sold it to viewers as drama. In reality, the problem was not the weapons, but how they were used and how logistics were organized. There were enough rifles, but not enough competent communication commanders in time for preparation. That is the truth. And the dramatic picture of unarmed soldiers is a lie designed to provoke emotions. Lie 2. The German Tiger tank was an invincible fortress. The Tiger was indeed a formidable machine, but its reputation was greatly inflated by cinematography. Yes, it had thick armor, and the gun could penetrate almost everything. The Allies feared it. Soviet tankers tried not to encounter it one-on-one. But the tank was slow, heavy, and required a huge amount of fuel. It was used in limited numbers because transmissions broke down on the front line. Tracks could not withstand the weight, and repairs took days. The Germans produced only about 1,350 Tigers during the entire war. A drop in the ocean. By comparison, Soviet T-34 tanks were produced in tens of thousands. In addition, by the time of the Allied landing in Normandy, the French resistance had disabled almost the entire railway network of France, and Germans simply could not deliver their Tigers to the front. Tanks got stuck on the way, burned on trains, and used up their last fuel on marches. Wars are won not by perfect machines, but by competent tactics and mass production. The Tiger was a symbol, a scarecrow for soldiers, but its real impact on the outcome of the war was far less than people believe. Lie 3. The Katyusha hit targets precisely. The BM-13 rocket launcher, nicknamed Katyusha, was not a sniper weapon at all. Its task was to fire 16 rockets into a square 1 by 1 kilometer and destroy everything alive in that area. It was a weapon of fear. The Germans called it Stalin's organ for its terrifying howl that broke the psyche even before the rockets landed. Imagine you are in a trench and hear an increasing whistle. The ground shakes, and a second later, a fiery storm falls on your position. Survivors said that after such a strike, soldiers lost their sanity, refused to hold the line, and fled. It was psychological terror, not high-precision artillery. Accuracy was not required here. The goal was to suppress, demoralize, and drive the enemy out of the trenches. The Katyusha did this brilliantly, but no one expected it to hit a specific house or tank. It covered an area, and that was enough. But wait. Lie 4. Lend-Lease aid from the Allies was insignificant and did not affect the war. For decades, Soviet propaganda claimed that the USSR won alone, and Allied help was minor. Two-thirds of Russians still believed the USSR could have won without Allies. In reality, Lend-Lease supplies were critical. The Allies sent thousands of trucks, locomotives, tons of explosives, aluminum for aircraft production, and food. American canned meat and powdered eggs fed the Red Army. Studebaker trucks transported shells, fuel, and the wounded. Without this, the mobility of the Red Army and aircraft production would have been much lower. Yes, the war was won by the Soviet Union with its own blood and sacrifice. But denying the role of Lend-Lease is rewriting history for ideology. Even Zhukov acknowledged after the war that without Lend-Lease it would have been much harder. This does not diminish the heroism of the Soviet people. It is a recognition of reality. The war was a collective effort, and the contribution of the Allies cannot be erased. Lie 5. The Soviet Union lived peacefully, and Germany treacherously attacked on June 22, 1941. By June 22, 1941, the USSR had already been participating in World War II for almost 2 years. The USSR divided Poland with Germany on September 17, 1939. Stalin and Hitler celebrated joint victory with a parade in Brest. Later, the Soviet Union attacked Finland, trying to seize its territories. The Winter War of 1939-40 became a shame for the Red Army. The Finns fought desperately, inflicted huge losses, but eventually ceded part of their land. Then the USSR annexed the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. There were deportations, mass arrests, tens of thousands of executions. The USSR seized Bessarabia from Romania. The army was partially mobilized, troops stood at the borders. Yes, Hitler's attack was a catastrophe for Stalin, but the USSR was not peaceful or neutral. This political myth was created to justify the leadership. History did not begin on June 22nd. It began on September 1, 1939, and the Soviet Union was an active participant. Lie 6. Soviet tanks, guns, and aircraft were inferior to German ones. In fact, at the beginning of the war, the USSR already had T-34 and KV tanks that surpassed most German machines in armor and firepower. The Soviet Union had more tanks than Germany. German tankers were shocked when they encountered T-34. Their shells bounced off Soviet armor, while the Soviet gun pierced German tanks through. The USSR had more aircraft and artillery. The problem was not in technology, but in organization, leadership, communication, training of commanders, and the surprise of the attack. Stalin destroyed the best commanders in 37-38, decapitating the army. New commanders lacked experience and feared making decisions without orders from above. Communication worked poorly. Germans acted quickly and cohesively, encircling units and cutting supply lines. The myth of technological inferiority is a convenient excuse for the catastrophe of the first months. The equipment existed, but it was used incompetently. Now the most curious part. Lie 7. Hitler launched a preemptive war against the USSR to prevent a Soviet invasion. This lie was born in Hitler's speech on June 22, 1941, and was repeated by German propaganda. Hitler claimed that the Soviet Union was preparing to attack and that Germany was forced to strike first. Goebbels spread this version throughout Europe. In reality, there were no plans for a Soviet invasion in the summer of 1941. Yes, Stalin understood that war was inevitable. Yes, the Red Army was preparing, but there was no concrete plan to attack Germany in the summer of 41. It was propaganda serving two goals: to justify aggression in the eyes of the German people, and to try to draw Western powers to his side for a campaign to the east. Hitler wanted to present himself as the defender of Europe from the Bolshevik threat. It did not work. No one believed it. But the myth lives on, and some historians still try to revive this version. And this is not all. Lie 8. Barrier troops shot all retreating soldiers. Barrier detachments were indeed created on June 27, 1941. Their task was to stop panicked soldiers, deserters, and those who fled from the battlefield. But mass executions are a myth. Most of the detained were sent back to their units or to penal battalions. Yes, there were cases of executions, but they were an extreme measure. According to statistics now available, barrier troops detained hundreds of thousands of people, but executed only a few thousand. The rest were returned to the front. Cinema blew this topic out of proportion, showing it as if a machine gunner stood behind every soldier. Reality was harsh, but not theatrical to that extent. Barrier units were a tool to maintain discipline during the chaos of the first months of the war. By mid-war, their role decreased, and by the end, they almost disappeared. There is an important detail here. Lie 9. All German generals were military geniuses. German generals made many strategic mistakes. Hitler made populist decisions, interfered with commanding troops, demanded to hold every meter of land, and forbade retreat. This led to encirclements and the loss of entire armies. Near Stalingrad, Hitler forbade a breakout from encirclement, although there was a chance to save the army. As a result, 300,000 men fell into the cauldron. Most died or were captured. German command overestimated their strength, underestimated the enemy, and failed to organize army supply in the winter of 1941. Guderian, Manstein, Rommel. Yes, they were talented commanders, but they also made mistakes, and those mistakes cost Germany the war. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht collapses when you look at the lost numbers and failed operations. Germans lost not because they were dumber or weaker, but because they fought against a huge country with colossal resources and a people unwilling to surrender. And here is what is truly interesting. Lee 10. Soviet losses amounted to tens of millions of soldiers killed due to incompetent command. In October 1941, Stalin declared that the Wehrmacht paid for every step with giant, irreplaceable losses and named the number 4.5 million killed and wounded. 2 weeks later, the newspaper Pravda increased this number to 6 million. Of course, it was propaganda, but the opposite extreme is also a myth. The claim that the Red Army simply buried Germans with corpses is false as well. Yes, Soviet losses were enormous, but a significant part of them were civilians killed by occupiers. Germans carried out genocide in occupied territories, executed Jews, Roma, communists, partisans, hostages, burned villages with residents inside. Millions died from hunger, disease, and forced labor. Soviet military losses are estimated at 8 to 10 million people. This is a colossal number, but it does not mean that every victim was the result of incompetent leadership. The war was brutal, and both sides suffered massive losses. The next point is no less surprising. Lie 11. All Soviet prisoners of war were traitors. After the war, Soviet POWs returning from German camps were met with suspicion. Many were sent to camps or exile. It was believed that anyone who was captured was a traitor. A true soldier was supposed to die or commit suicide rather than surrender. This was cruel logic. Most were captured not by choice. In the encirclements of the early months, communication was lost, ammunition ran out, and command could not organize a retreat. The wounded remained on the battlefield and were taken by Germans. Calling them traitors is unfair and cruel. Out of 5.5 million Soviet POWs, more than half died in German camps from hunger, cold, disease, and abuse. Those who survived and returned deserve respect, but instead received suspicion and repression. This is one of the darkest pages of Soviet history. If you like our videos about amazing facts, myths, and bold exposure of lies, support us with a like and write the number 1 in the comments. If you don't, put 0. This will help us understand what interests you and make our episodes even better. Lie 12. Germans provided their soldiers with everything needed for winter warfare. German command did not prepare the army for winter in 1941. Soldiers froze in summer uniforms. Equipment would not start. Oil solidified in engines. Why? Because Hitler counted on a blitzkrieg and victory before winter. All plans were based on the assumption that by autumn the USSR would capitulate. When it became clear that the war was dragging on, it was already too late. Supplies could not keep up with advancing troops. Railways were destroyed. Partisans blew up trains. Winter clothing got stuck somewhere in the rear. This strategic miscalculation cost the Wehrmacht tens of thousands of frostbitten and frozen soldiers. German soldiers wrote desperate letters home, asking for warm clothes, wool socks, mittens. Mothers and wives knitted and sent parcels. But this did not solve the problem. The army froze, and this was also part of its defeat. And now what is surprising? Lie 13. The French resistance had almost no influence on the course of the war. The French resistance did colossal work. They blew up trains, cut cables, and passed intelligence to the Allies. By the day of the Normandy landings, they had brilliantly disabled almost the entire railway network of France. The Germans could not transfer their tanks and troops to the front because the rails suddenly ended. Bridges were blown up, trains derailed, switches changed at the worst possible moment. It was sabotage that saved thousands of Allied lives and sped up the liberation of France. But the French resistance is often downplayed as insignificant. In reality, partisans tied down entire German divisions, which were forced to guard communications and fight underground groups. These were divisions that could have fought at the front, but had to remain in the rear. The contribution of the resistance was enormous, and without it, the liberation of Europe would have taken longer and cost more lives. Now pay attention. Lie 14. Siberian divisions saved Moscow in the autumn of 1941. Yes, Siberian divisions were transferred to Moscow, and they were indeed well prepared. They were fresh, rested, equipped units thrown into counteroffensive, but they were not as numerous as commonly believed. A major role was played by reserve divisions formed throughout the country, as well as militia units and troops that broke out of encirclements. Moscow was saved by everyone together: Siberians, Muscovites, Ural soldiers, Ukrainians. The myth that only the Siberians stopped the Germans is an oversimplification. It is a convenient legend that sounds beautiful, but does not reflect the whole picture. Everyone who stood near Moscow in those November and December days made their contribution. Siberians were an important part of this victory, but not the only one. And now another point surfaces. Lie 15. The Battle of Moscow ended in a complete defeat of the Germans in the winter of 1941. The Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow was successful, but the Germans were not crushed. They retreated but maintained combat capability, and already in January restored the front line. The Red Army failed to take Rezhov and Smolensk in the spring of 1942. The battles for Rezhov continued until the spring of 1943 and cost enormous losses. The Germans held these cities until the autumn of 1943. The Battle of Moscow was an important victory, but the war was far from over. The Germans recovered, regrouped, and in the summer of '42 launched a new offensive in the south towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. The victory near Moscow boosted morale, showing that the Germans could be beaten, but a complete defeat was still far away. And here is what raises questions. Lie 16. The USSR hid the truth about the war. The Soviet Union indeed concealed many facts about the catastrophe of the war's beginning: the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, massive losses, the role of Lend-Lease, deportations of peoples, and executions of its own soldiers. The truth was inconvenient and did not fit the heroic narrative. But after the collapse of the USSR, archives were opened and historians gained access to documents. Today we know much more than our parents and grandparents did. The problem is that myths are resilient and pass from generation to generation through movies and textbooks. Many still believe versions invented for propaganda. The truth is complex, multi-layered, and often unpleasant, but it must be known to understand what really happened. But there is another version. Lie 17. World War II began on June 22, 1941. World War II began on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. On September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. It was the division of a country between two dictators. Calling the Soviet-German War the Great Patriotic War and treating it as the beginning of World War II is an ideological trick that hides inconvenient facts. The term Great Patriotic War was created to form an image of a united uprising of the Soviet people against invaders. But for many peoples of the USSR, this war was not patriotic. The Baltic peoples, who were deported and executed in '40, were not eager to defend the USSR. Ukrainians and Belarusians, who lived through famine and repression, also did not always see the Soviet Union as their homeland. Reality is more complex than propaganda cliches. The next point is no less surprising. 18. The Nuremberg trials judged all war crimes of World War II. The Nuremberg trials convicted Nazi criminals, and this was an important step. For the first time in history, war criminals were judged by an international court. But aggressive actions of the USSR against Poland and Finland, the annexation of the Baltic states, war crimes and crimes against humanity did not receive proper assessment. Why? Because the Soviet Union was one of the victors and a judge at the trials. History is written by the winners, and inconvenient facts remain in the shadows. The Katyn massacre of Polish officers was blamed on the Germans. Only 50 years later, the USSR admitted its guilt. Deportations of entire peoples, Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Ingush, and Kalmyks, were not condemned. They simply disappeared from official history. Nuremberg was justice of the victors, not an objective trial of all war crimes. And now comes a new story. Lie 19. All Germany's allies were fascists and criminals. Germany had allies. Italy, Romania, Hungary, Finland, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Croatia. But not all of them were fascist states in the full sense. Finland, for example, fought the USSR to regain territories lost in the Winter War. It was a war of revenge, not ideology. Romania fought for Bessarabia, which the USSR took in 40. Hungary wanted to restore lands lost after World War I. Of course, this does not justify their actions. But simplifying history to "they were all fascists" is wrong. Among these countries were those who participated in the Holocaust, killed civilians, looted occupied territories. But there were also those who simply tried to return the lost or defend their interests. The story of Germany's allies is complex and ambiguous. Let's move further. Lie 20. Soviet partisans controlled vast territories behind enemy lines. The partisan movement was large-scale, but not everywhere successful. In Belarus and Ukraine, partisans really controlled entire regions, blew up bridges, attacked garrisons. But in other regions, the partisan movement was weak or absent. The Germans conducted brutal punitive operations, destroyed villages, executed hostages. The partisan war was bloody and merciless on both sides. Germans hanged partisans, executed their families, burned villages. Partisans ambushed, killed soldiers, blew up trains. Civilians were caught between two fires. Some supported partisans, others feared German reprisals. The partisan movement made an important contribution to victory, but the price was horrifying. And here is what is usually not mentioned. Lie 21. All German soldiers were convinced Nazis. Most German soldiers were ordinary conscripts who followed orders. Of course, there were devoted Nazis among them, SS members who committed war crimes. They burned villages, shot Jews, tortured prisoners of war. But there were also those who did not share the regime's ideology, yet could not refuse service. Refusal meant execution or a concentration camp. Many German soldiers simply wanted to survive and return home. They fought because they had no choice. This does not justify their participation in the war, but it shows that reality is more complex than a division into absolute good and absolute evil. After the war, many Germans claimed they knew nothing about the Holocaust, the death camps, or mass executions. This was a lie. Everyone knew, but admitting it meant admitting guilt. And there is more. Lie 22. The war ended on May 9, 1945. For Europe, the war ended on May 9th, but for Asia only on September 2, 1945, when Japan signed the Act of Surrender. The war with Japan in the Far East continued until August 1945, when the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan and crushed the Kwantung Army. This is often forgotten, but for millions of people in Asia, the war lasted longer. The Japanese occupied China, Korea, Indonesia, the Philippines. They carried out policies of cruelty and terror. The Nanjing Massacre, Unit 731, which conducted experiments on humans, prisoner of war camps. All this was part of the Japanese War. And this war ended only after the atomic bombings and the entry of the USSR into the war in the Far East, and now a fact rarely discussed. Lie 23. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary to end the war. Americans claim that the bombings saved lives because without them, an invasion of Japan would have been necessary, leading to enormous losses. But there is a version that Japan was already ready to surrender, especially after the Soviet Union entered the war. The Japanese leadership understood that the war was lost. The Americans dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima on August 6th and on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. Hundreds of thousands of civilians died. The bombings were a demonstration of power to the USSR in the beginning of the Cold War. America showed that it possessed superweapons and was ready to use them. This question still causes debate. Were the bombings justified or were they war crimes? There is no definitive answer. And from here begins the most interesting. Lie 24. The Germans developed superweapons that could have changed the course of the war. The Germans indeed worked on jet aircraft, V-2 rockets, new type submarines, even on an atomic bomb. But most of these projects were never implemented on a mass scale. V-2 rockets terrorized London, but did not change the course of the war. They were inaccurate, expensive, and required enormous resources. Jet aircraft appeared too late. New series submarines did not enter the ocean in sufficient numbers. Superweapons are a myth born after the war to explain why Germany lost. Some historians claim that if Hitler had another half-year or year, he could have reversed the war. This is fantasy. Germany was doomed because it fought against a coalition that surpassed it in resources, manpower, and industry. And then comes an unexpected turn. Lie 25. The war was won on the battlefields. The war was won not only on the battlefields, but also in the rear. Soviet factories worked around the clock. Evacuated plants produced tanks, aircraft, ammunition. Women, the elderly, and teenagers stood at the machines. American industry supplied the Allies with equipment and materials. Without this rear support, without this total effort, victory would have been impossible. War is not only the front, it is economy, logistics, and mobilization of all resources. Soviet women worked in factories, dug trenches, grew crops, raised children. They held the country on their shoulders. American farmers and workers produced food and equipment that fed and armed the armies. British workers repaired ships, built aircraft, produced tanks. It was a total war in which everyone participated. This changes everything. Lie 26. German submarines sank all Allied convoys. The Battle of the Atlantic was fierce. German submarines sank merchant ships carrying supplies to Europe, but the Allies developed effective countermeasures. The convoy system, air patrols, radar, and depth charges. By the middle of the war, submarine losses became critical for Germany. The Battle of the Atlantic was won by the Allies, and this ensured the supply of armies. German submariners called themselves Grey Wolves, but by 43 these wolves had become victims. Dozens of submarines were sunk. Out of 40,000 German submariners, 30,000 did not return. It was the most dangerous service in the Wehrmacht. Let's move to the next point. Lie 27. Life on a submarine was romantic. Life on a German submarine was a nightmare. Cramped space, stale air, the smell of diesel, sweat, mold, and rotten food. Underwear was not changed for months. They slept in shifts on the same warm bunks. It was not heroism. It was a celebration of claustrophobia and unsanitary conditions. Most German submariners never returned from missions. The mortality rate among crews was one of the highest in the Wehrmacht. A submarine could be destroyed at any moment. Depth charge, torpedo, ramming. The crew had no chance of escape. They drowned in cold water, suffocated in sealed compartments, died from wounds. The romance of submarine warfare is a cinematic illusion. Reality was dirty, terrifying, and deadly. Let's move on. Lie 28. Soviet soldiers were provided with everything they needed. At the front, even the most basic necessities were often lacking. Food, warm clothing, medicine. Wounded soldiers died from infections because antibiotics were insufficient. Soldiers starved when supply lines collapsed. Of course, the command tried to provide the troops, but in wartime conditions, it was extremely difficult. The reality of the front was far from parade-like movie scenes. Soldiers ate watery soup, slept in trenches, froze in winter, suffocated in summer heat. They suffered from dysentery, malaria, typhus. They lost comrades, saw death every day. It was not a heroic film war. It was a dirty, bloody, exhausting struggle for survival. Now something often hidden. Lie 29. All concentration camps were death camps. The Germans created a system of concentration camps where political prisoners, prisoners of war, Jews, Roma, homosexuals, and disabled people were held. There were death camps where people were killed in gas chambers, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor. But there were also labor camps where people were exploited to death. The difference was small. In both, death was present. Only the methods differed. The Holocaust claimed 6 million Jewish lives and millions of others. It was a planned industrial extermination of entire peoples. The Germans built death factories where people were killed like cattle. It was a crime against humanity with no justification. But the memory of the Holocaust is often used for political purposes, and this is also a problem. Now another point emerges. Lie 30. Sanitary conditions at the front were acceptable. On the Eastern Front, both German and Soviet sanitary conditions were catastrophic. Lice, dysentery, typhus, gangrene. All of this killed soldiers no less than bullets. Epidemics claimed thousands of lives. It was not a clean war. It was a celebration of filth and incompetence in medical organization. Soldiers went months without washing, wore the same clothes, slept in mud. Wounds became infected, festered, turned into rotting ulcers. Medicine was lacking. Surgeons worked without anesthesia, amputated limbs hastily. Many wounded preferred death rather than going to a field hospital. This was the reality of war, one not usually spoken of. And here is one more example. Lie 31. All war heroes received deserved awards. Many heroic acts went unnoticed. Thousands of soldiers performed heroic deeds but died, and no one learned about them. Awards were given to those who survived and whose feats were documented. But how many jumped onto embrasures, covered comrades, or carried the wounded from under fire, yet did not live to receive recognition? Their names are lost, but their contribution is priceless. War is not only medals and orders, it is millions of anonymous heroes who did their duty without seeking glory. They dug trenches, carried shells, repaired equipment, cooked porridge, bandaged the wounded. Without them, victory would not have been possible. But no one remembers their names. Time to move further. Lie 32. After the war, all countries lived in peace. After the war, Europe was divided into two blocks, the West under U.S. influence and the East under Soviet control. The Cold War began and lasted almost half a century. There were local conflicts, an arms race, the threat of nuclear war. Peace was fragile and held by a balance of fear. World War II did not bring peace. It changed the map of the world and sparked new conflicts. Wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and the Middle East were continuations of the confrontation between the two systems. Millions of people died in these conflicts. The Cold War could at any moment become hot, and humanity stood on the brink of nuclear destruction. Only the collapse of the USSR ended the confrontation, but peace has still not truly come. Lie 33. We know the whole truth about World War II. Many archives remain classified, many documents destroyed. There are white spots we know little about. Historians continue studying the war, discovering new facts, revising old versions. The war ended 81 years ago, but debates do not cease. Every country views the war through its own history, ideology, and interests. There is no single truth. There are different versions, interpretations, emphases. Russia sees the war as the Great Patriotic War, Ukraine as a struggle for independence, the Baltic states as occupation, Western Europe as liberation from Nazism. Everyone is right and wrong at the same time. The war is too complex to fit into a single narrative. As long as different points of view exist, the truth will remain somewhere in between, elusive and hard to grasp. Here we have reached all 33 wild lies about World War II. What remains debatable? Almost everything. Historians still argue about the causes of the war, the role of each country, the price of victory, who was right and who was wrong. Many interpretations exist, none final. Archives open, documents are declassified, new evidence appears, and the picture changes. The war was complex, layered, full of contradictions. Simplifying it into a single scheme means betraying the memory of those who lived through that hell. History does not tolerate lies, but it also shows that truth is always more complicated than we want to believe. Every fact has context. Every event, a background, every decision, consequences. We may argue about details, but one thing remains undeniable. World War II was the most terrible catastrophe in human history. It took the lives of more than 60 million people, destroyed cities and nations, changed the destiny of entire peoples. Our task is to remember this, without distorting facts, without forcing history to fit ideology, without forgetting the lessons of the past. Only then can we avoid repeating that nightmare. Thank you for being with us. Until next episodes.